Amen. Please do sit down, and some handouts are going to come round because I was too disorganised to get things printed in the booklet. Just to introduce myself, if you haven't met me, I'm Pete Jackson, and I'm the Director of Training for AMiE. But when I'm not doing that, I'm pastoring Christchurch Walkley, which of course is most of the time. And isn't it so good to be here? Isn't it good to be here after 2 years since we last met? So good to be together again. This session is a little bit different, I guess, although it does follow on from what Mark was sharing with us this afternoon in a hopefully a very practical way. As he was saying then, there's the context of a crisis of leadership, and certainly a conversation about a crisis in leadership going on in evangelical circles throughout our land and even wider. And the aim in this session is to communicate with you AMiE's initial commitments for implementing some lessons from the recent reports that Mark was referencing to that are part of that crisis and part of that conversation about leadership. The recent reports, the ones particularly on Jonathan Fletcher and Crowded House, but the general lessons that seem to be coming out of this whole conversation. But let me begin with some words that I had the privilege of being reminded of in a very wonderful way twice in the autumn last year when I attended 2 AMiE ordinations. These are some of the words that Bishop Andy charged the candidates with. Have it always printed on your memory just how great a treasure is committed to your charge. The church and congregation whom you serve are Christ's spouse and body. They are his sheep which he purchased with his death and for whom he shed his blood. You know what a great fault you will be guilty of if any member of his church is hurt or hindered as a result of your negligence, and that God will discipline you. Therefore remember what God has called you to do. Never cease your careful and diligent labours until you've done all that you possibly can, according to your duty, to bring all those who are committed to your charge to a knowledge of God, unity in the faith, and maturity in Christ, so that no place is given to erroneous belief or wrong behaviour. A charge to ministers in AMiE, whether recently or soon to be ordained, or a reminder for us if we were ordained some time ago. And it comes to us, doesn't it, in a context shaped by failures in leadership and leadership abuses and a general conversation about those things. And we've been talking about that obviously in AMiE, and these commitments are coming out of some of that conversation. I want to say a few things sort of by way of introduction, then I'll go through the commitments, and then there'll be an opportunity for us to chat about one or two things in groups, hopefully, if we get the time. These commitments are about AMiE as a convocation. So individual churches will be having their own reviews and reassessments, and that will be different in different contexts as to how much you're doing that and why you're doing that and the ways in which you're doing that. These are not, in a sense, commitments for each local church to individually adopt, but they are about our life as a convocation. That obviously does then relate to and filter down to local churches in all sorts of ways, in important ways, but they're primarily about those aspects of gospel life and ministry that we share together in our partnership as a convocation, and therefore it affects the life of the local church as it relates to that. And how can we as a convocation in that gospel partnership, those aspects of gospel ministry that we share together, how can we implement lessons from what is going on and from these reviews? And that wider discussion, I want to suggest that wider discussion about leadership is you don't need me to tell you this, but it is deeply relevant to AMiE and to AMiE as a convocation. Surely, one of the reasons AMiE exists is because of a conviction that what God has given us in the Anglican expression of gospel doctrine and gospel ministry, whilst not the only faithful one, that expression that we find in the Reformers that is, under God's grace, bearing fruit and growing around the world, because we're part of a global thing, that's an expression that has great potential for the re-evangelization of our land and beyond. Well, I think we can say that the issues around the 31.8 report sort of present a similar opportunity in that regards, an aspect of it. In one sense, all these commitments are kind of just asking AMiE to sort of become what it wants to be better at what it is that we want to be as a convocation, as the kind of gospel partnership that we want to have and that we want to be. A gospel partnership where there's interdependence between local churches with mutual recognition of ministry orders and oversight from godly bishops. I would say pressing into that and saying, how can we do that better is a very good response to all of the... It's not a fix-all by any means, but it's a very good response to lots of the issues that are there in this wider conversation around leadership and the things that have... Some of the things where that has gone wrong, and sadly, the sad things that have happened. In shared leadership and power being dispersed and proper authority and accountability at the local level is so important, isn't it? But it's not all, is it? And how we're governed and led and supported episcopally, and how churches are interdependent, and all the things that fosters, I think, can be a part of responding rightly to these issues that have come out in this conversation about leadership, and can be an effective part of sort of trying to put into practice the truth that leaders and pastors of churches are sinners in the middle of their sanctification. And I think it's also part and parcel of a great opportunity we have at this moment. AMiE is still a young institution. We'll get to a point where we won't be able to sort of say that we're at this crucial moment of everything just being new and whatever. That will at some point get old, but I don't think that's yet. Last time we met, we weren't a convocation. 2 years on, things are different. There's people in the room that were not in the room 2 years ago at the last conference. Things are different, things are shaping up, but we're still very young institutionally. We're still sort of bedding down institutionally. And whilst institutional arrangements are not the only part of what we're talking about, it is true, isn't it, that institutions can preserve but also influence and perpetuate cultures. And if we want a healthy leadership culture, what we are institutionally and how we practice that can be a big help. So it's part and parcel of an opportunity. There is in that sense sadness bound up with everything that we're talking about now, in all sorts of ways, and that's important to recognise and acknowledge. But it's also good to see it as, under God's kindness, a great opportunity for us, given what we stand for as AMiE, given what we want to be about, and given, if you're in the room and you're a minister, the ministry that we've been charged with. I think we can be glad of the opportunities that the Lord is giving us to learn and grow in health. I thought it might be helpful to reiterate the process by which we got to these commitments. So some of you will know this because you were very much a part of it, but not everybody will. Last spring, when these reports were relatively fresh out, we held a conversation on Zoom, the regular sort of Tuesday meeting of people in AMiE, often mainly ministers, but certainly not exclusively ministers. That was given over to a conversation about this. A broad-ranging discussion, sort of first reactions to what was coming out in some of these reports and the lessons that we might want to learn and how we might go about that. After that had been thought about and processed a bit, ministers were then asked, anyone who was going to be part of that conversation was then asked to submit suggestions or thoughts that they had about sort of coming up with some initial commitments, outlining what it is we're going to do at the beginning, initially, to respond to this. And the Renew ones, if you're familiar with those, were sort of given as an example of the kind of thing we were talking about, but not that we would just adopt those, but that we would think it through for ourselves. That was in advance of a second Minister Zoom conversation that happened in October, based on people's suggestions that had been submitted and other things that people suggested during the meeting itself. All of those were sort of written up and minutes taken. I was then asked to draft from those conversations some suggested initial commitments based on what had been said. And I did that with feedback and input from a few people, some of whom are in the room, so thanks to them for their help. And then those were submitted to the standing committee, along with the minutes of those Zoom conversations that we'd had and that sort of thing, and they talked it through and agreed the commitments for being communicated today. But also the other thing that influenced the shape of these commitments was Andy Lyne's initial statement on behalf of Anglican Network in Europe when the Jonathan Fletcher report was first published. One thing that should hopefully be clear by what I've just told you about the story of us arriving at these commitments is that I'm not standing here as some sort of an expert in this. I don't have, for example, Mark Sterling's learning and study in this area of leadership. I'm not standing here because these are my answers. And my role has been to try to be a good listener to the conversations that we had and to be a good interpreter and processor of those conversations, and in the hopes that that would be of service to our gospel partnership. And it's also worth saying, therefore, I hope it's clear as well, these are initial commitments, so we don't think this is the end of the thing. These are initial commitments. This is designed to be a start. And you'll see, hopefully, that we've actually tried to structure that idea of them being a start into the very commitments themselves. One of the issues that came through strongly in the second minister's discussion was the need to be concrete. Lots of people were very helpful in saying that. What we don't want to do is just sort of signal our commitment to some ideas that are left hanging in the air without any way of measuring whether we've sort of done anything about it or not. We want to be concrete. And yet when it came to the drafting process of these commitments, it became clear that we do need to state the principle as well. And that when it comes to being concrete, actually that's something that needs to be a shared task with different people taking responsibility in different ways. And so how that's reflected in the commitments that you've got on your handout is that the commitment is stated and then there's a bit in italics below it. That is kind of like an example by way of illustration. These are not at the moment set in stone, because at points I've been speaking for people who have not sort of made that decision themselves. You know, people who are responsible for safeguarding for AMiE, for example. So they're kind of illustrative suggestions. The idea is that following all of this, the exec and other leaders as relevant in AMiE will look at these 7 commitments and figure out concrete ways over the next 12 months that their department might be implementing some of these things. So the bits in italics are illustrative suggestions about how we would make this concrete. It's also worth saying as well, finally, before I sort of finish waggling on the tee, that as with the ministers' conversations, we're all hearing this and thinking about this and reflecting on this in different places. And depending on our own situation and background and experience, some of us will have experienced difficult and bullying leadership or be very close to others who have. Some of us will have questions and be nervous about where some of the discussion is going and where some of the assumptions are and influences of bigger discussions in the outside world, and be concerned about that and be worried that we don't do things that are not principled as a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. And many, many other things, many, many other responses. I think these commitments attempt to address some of those differing legitimate concerns, and I hope that is clear. But under the overall conviction that this is an opportunity that we must seize, and these are things that we must be learning and developing under God in a healthy way, for the sake of our faithfulness to that call, that charge to ministry that I read at the beginning, if we're an ordained minister, for the sake of the health of our churches and for the sake of the gospel in the communities where we're scattered. So let me run through the commitments, and at points I'll sort of point out one or two things and clarify one or two things which hopefully will be helpful. So the first one is that we commit to making godliness of character the primary requirement for ordained ministry. in the assessment and training of ordinands, and in the regular review and support of ordained ministers. That's something that comes through very strongly in these issues, isn't it? Character, godliness over gifting, over charisma. For example, the AMiE executive could review annually the questions that are asked of ordinands and joining churches and ministers, and looking at those that are used in ministerial biannual reviews with this issue of keeping godliness and character front and centre in mind. So that just becomes part of how we do business. Secondly, we commit to carefully reviewing the exercise of authority across the convocation in order to develop healthy biblical patterns of the exercise of authority. For example, a group of leaders writing a set of questions or areas for regular review around the exercise of authority and leadership culture that could be used in Episcopal visits to AMiE churches. But there are many, you will think of other examples, I'm sure, of how we could do that. There are resources that others are producing that might be things that are worth looking at, sort of audits and that sort of a thing, tools that we could make available, those kind of things. 3, we commit to developing a positive culture around safeguarding, so that safeguarding best practice can be worked out in the context of our Reformed and Evangelical Anglican theology and ecclesiology. For example, it could be something that we get a working group at Synod to explore, to do some hard thinking on that, or we could figure out a way to work even more closely with CSS, who handle safeguarding things for AMiE, to look into that. This sort of idea of a positive culture around safeguarding is again something that comes up a lot in the reports, and how sometimes safeguarding was sort of seen only as a sort of a necessary inconvenience or worse. But that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean therefore we have to accept every development in the wider world that comes under the heading of safeguarding, and every assumption that there is, without thinking about it. And that's why there's the second half of that, about it being worked out in the context of our Reformed and Evangelical Anglican theology and ecclesiology. It would be very easy for us to use things that we might find our intention with scriptural teaching in the wider world of safeguarding. It's very easy for us to use that as an excuse for therefore neglecting safeguarding. We mustn't do that. No, we've got to put these things in conversation with our theology and work out how can we make safeguarding work for the benefit of gospel ministry and for healthy leadership in churches. And I think those who've done, if you took part in any of the training last term with CSS, Christian Safeguarding Services, I think it seems to me that's where they're trying to look at things and do those things like that. So that could be potentially a fruitful partnership for us, is what I'm saying by that. Fourthly, we commit to growing structures and practices of episcopal oversight which will provide accountability and correction, embodying biblical justice, mercy and grace. For example, maybe there's a need that we review that process of discipline set out in AMiE's canons and constitution, and consider as part of that issues of reconciliation and restoration. What does that look like? That we're in the business of gospel ministry. So those issues are really important, and yet so easy to get wrong, I'm sure. Fifthly, we commit to theological study and learning that is prayerful, deep, rich, reflective, taking in a variety of voices globally and historically, believing that this helps to foster and is an expression of meekness and humility in leadership. For example, one idea we've got in the training department is to think about how to form a sort of a theological resource team who could reactively at points or proactively at other points provide resource to help the convocation resource itself theologically. And part of the thinking of this and how this came out of the discussion on leadership is it's that there's a tendency identified in some of these reports that, just as there's been a tendency, I guess, to have an informal oversight from charismatic leaders, with strong networks of connection. And I guess to some of that, therefore, we're saying that's why we want formal oversight to do that better and well, because the informality of it can be abused, sadly, or is where the devil can create mischief. I guess there's the same thing with theology, isn't it? Is that sometimes if we sort of do all of our theological thinking by gut instinct based on the big name platform speakers and what they say, or, oh, well, so-and-so's got a book coming out about that, and that will tell us all what to think. That is part of this culture on leadership, and I was so impressed with and struck by what Mark was saying about the need for really good theology in all of this. Sixthly, we commit to growing in biblical diversity. We will seek to increasingly reflect the impartiality of our God and Father at every level of Convocation leadership and in the communities of our member churches, that our member churches are seeking to serve in the gospel. For example, we're looking at the pathways into AMiE, membership planting, ordination, see how they can be developed to see AMiE member churches established in communities across a greater spectrum of diversity than is currently the case. But there's many, many other aspects to that as well, including the things you were sharing with us, Karen, a moment or two ago. This one was a difficult one to word, because for some of us, the word diversity will sort of bring us out in hives, just because of how it's used in the wider culture. I think we should reclaim it, because every tongue and tribe and nation before the throne, and men and women, and adults and children, and slave and free, and all those things. But that's why it's qualified with biblical diversity, because this is a word that is abused, and it's abused even in the wider church scene. But I don't know that there's necessarily a better way of putting it. Although the second phrase that's used there of the impartiality of our God and Father, that was taken from Andy Lyne's immediate reflections on all of this. His statement on the AMiE website back in March last year. And again, I think that it grasps something really important to the gospel that we can learn in all of this. That impartiality of God. God isn't looking at what school you went to or that sort of thing. And I rejoice at the accents in this room, for example. Even though my own sort of, you have to catch me off guard to get the flat vowels of East Yorkshire coming out of me every now and again. I rejoice in it, but we want more, don't we? We want more. AMiE isn't the answer to the re-evangelisation of England, but in as much as we want to be a part of that, we want to reach all sorts of different communities. I think AMiE is growing in certain kinds of diversity, but we want to do more, don't we? And let's look at the things we can do to do that. And that will help us have healthier leadership that's not based on particular power structures or ideas of prestige or other ways that it's done in the world. We do believe, don't we, all kinds of people can be gifted for and called into many different kinds of gospel ministry. We want our Convocation leadership to reflect that. Hence biblical diversity and the language of the impartiality of God. God is not a respecter of persons. So then, seventhly, we commit to ensuring these commitments are implemented. For example, after 12 months, we will report back the concrete steps that have been taken on 1 to 6, and then update these commitments to reflect progress made. Just looking at the time, I think there probably are a few minutes. If people have got questions for clarification, I might be able to help. Tim?
It's not really a question of clarification.
That's okay.
Although it is.
Okay.
There is this very significant document called Faithfulness in Service, which has come out of singing dances. It's a code of conduct for pastoral ministry for all church leaders in the Anglican network in Europe, so the guys here in ACE and also for us in AMiE. As I understand it, that should be sent out to all the churches to be reading and looking at and adopting, for it to then go to the synod in the summer for adoption, and for us as a convocation to adopt it, so that basically the whole of the Anglican network in Europe adopts it. We hope at that point to enshrine that document, a code of conduct for us as leaders, within our constitution and canons. So it is a clarification, but it's also letting us all know there is something coming, that the ACE guys have already got it. We should have it as church leaders in AMiE. And I think it really ought to be a number 8 on here, that we are committed to proceeding with that as and when. But I don't know whether Andy, or looking around for Lee's not in. Lee's there. Lee, I don't know if Lee could answer it or someone, just to join the dots up and bring clarification if need be.
So do you want me to clarify your question?
If you could.
Yeah, there is that document that's been mentioned. So the last discussion about that document was at the AMiE Standing Committee, and then the decision of that committee was that would be sent out to the AMiE Synod Trust. So that's the body that represents the churches. So 2 years ago we didn't have a body where you could have representation, but now you have a body which has clergy and laity from each church, which represents the church. So that document that has been seen at different levels needs to be sent out imminently. I can't remember the exact timescale, but it's imminently to all the reps for them to therefore talk about that, and then it'll get to the reps who they talk about at local church, but it will come to synod in June for us to adopt that.
Great.
So what I would encourage is don't put it as an 8. Move it around, because the last one you want is we are committed to these.
Yeah.
So how it fits in.
In effect, it sounds to me, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like it is a concrete step that can be done in fulfilment of perhaps a few of these, but won't obviously be the only thing. But that is something concrete that we are doing that can be in line with this.
The one that and the good thing to state it in some ways that it's done in partnership with our brothers and sisters in ACE as well. So it keeps on joining the dots that we're not just doing this our way without any relationship, but we are connected together joyfully. And so it's good to keep on reinforcing that now and again, just to write it down so that when people scan our documents, they just see that principle written out.
Great, thank you. Sounds good. Leo.
That's been really helpful. On point 5, is that essentially listening to voices outside our sort of normal constituency, so that we're able to sort of see things, not just be listening to the same voices all the time? Is that what you're meaning by that one?
Yeah, I think it would be part of that. Yeah, I think it's why globally and historically is it now is I think that's a strength of being what we are as Anglican mission in England, is that we're part of a worldwide family who can teach us things, and we're part of a historical, we're self-consciously rooted in a history, and that just makes for theological health, and maybe helps where sort of these power structures and charismatic individuals are associated with this kind of way of, the big name on the platform said it, and that's how we decide what we think. It was actually, if we're rooted in the worldwide Anglican Communion and the historical Anglican Communion, that can be of real help to us. It wasn't sort of necessarily being any more specific than that. Great. Any more? Let me just say a couple of more very, very general things, because obviously there are formal and there are informal aspects of our gospel partnership, and they're all important. And I think one of the things about our actual sort of fellowship, if you like, is that it can be an early warning system and a sort of a means of prevention in leadership issues arising. Because, let's face it, sin really loves the dark, doesn't it? And being isolated as a church or as a minister can be a form of being in the dark, can't it? Think, for example, what mischief could Satan do with a bunch of ministers who feel sorry for themselves and are growing in battle-weary bitterness. When sin isn't just going to come because of, certain things that we can point to, the individuals that are involved in the reports that have happened, and sin doesn't just come to one class of minister or one background or anything like that. What mischief could Satan do with a bunch of isolated ministers who feel sorry for themselves and are growing in battle-weary bitterness? And just for one simple illustration, I think, of why this is an opportunity for us, all these things that we're trying to learn about. Such an opportunity for us. I don't know the number of times I've joined the AMiE Zoom call on a Tuesday, and it's been a great moment for lifting my eyes up from the immediate concerns and niggles and struggles and difficulties, and reminded me of all sorts of really basic and really important things, and given me news of gospel fruit elsewhere and that sort of a thing. And that's just one illustration, I think, of how our fellowship can serve really practically in those things. Let's keep praying for each other. And ministers, keep coming to that midweek Zoom if and when you can. Let's welcome the review processes that Andy Lyons is setting up for trustees to implement. Let's lean into our gospel partnership, whether that's the formal or the informal aspects. And so before we sort of close in a song, I wonder if you could take 2 or 3 minutes, just turn to the people around you and think about this question. How can our gospel partnership across the convocation, how can it help us to grow and maintain the health of leadership in our churches? How can we do those simple things, relational things, to keep growing healthy leadership? 2 or 3 minutes, and after we've had a few minutes, John Causey, if you just decide when to start us.